So, good evening, everybody. We are starting our very last part of this long and interesting conference with a specific closing plenary devoted to the issue of inequalities and differences, with two different speakers. The first speaker will be Christopher WHELAN, and the second speaker will be Gurminder Brahma. The first speech will be more related to the issue of economic and social inequalities. The second one will be more related with cultural and political post-colonial issues. Okay, just start then with our first speaker. I will briefly introduce him just in case you do not yet know Christopher WHELAN. Chris is an emeritus professor of sociology at the School of Sociology and the Geary Institute for Public Policy, University College Dublin. He was formerly professor of sociology at the School of Sociology, Social Policy and Social Work, Queen's University Belfast, and chair of the Standing Committee of the Social Sciences of the European Science Foundation and the European Consortium for Social Research. His research interests include the causes and consequences of poverty and inequality, social mobility and inequality, and recently had a substantial involvement on the Growing Inequalities Impacts Project. He has published extensively on these topics and on economic and social change in Ireland during bust and booms. So, Chris, yours is the floor.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? No, it's not on. Okay. Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, fine. Thank you very much. Okay. Firstly, I'd like to thank the ESA committee for asking me to come and speak here today and to congratulate them on the extraordinary job they've done in organising this conference. I dread to think the amount of work that must have been involved in setting this up. Finally, I'd like to thank all you dedicated souls who are still here for the last session. The numbers far exceed what I was expecting. The really sharp-eyed, if you will, notice that I've changed my title slightly and put in polarization or squeeze middle in the Great Recession, which I think probably better reflects the findings of the work I've done. This is joint work with my colleague Brian Nolan at Oxford University and Bertrand Mate at the Economic and Social Research Institute in Dublin. For quite some time, we've been, doing work on issues of multidimensionality in relation to inequality, looking at how going beyond conventional income measures can help us in locating broader patterns of stratification. In relation to this paper, the question we were asking ourselves was, what has been the impact of the Great Recession on the distribution of certain inequalities across income classes? I'll come on to define what I mean by income classes. But what we wanted to know was, taking 2008 as a starting point and 2012 as an end point, those points chosen because they were points at which the EU Silk data set allows us to make fairly wide comparisons across Europe. What happened in terms of the distribution of across income classes, of income itself, material deprivation, and most particularly and most importantly for us in the context in which we're looking, economic stress. And I'll go on to say how we distinguish between these different aspects. But when you start to look at this, as all of you know, the debate on income inequality and the impact of inequality has been dominated by two main pieces of work. Thomas Piketty's work on inequality, his book entitled Capital. Although obviously it's not simply Thomas Piketty, there's a whole range of work behind Piketty's book involving...
Could you kindly speak in the micro, please?
Okay.
Because otherwise people do not listen.
Okay.
Thank you.
There's a whole range of work behind Piketty's work, by Tony Atkinson and a whole group of people of that sort. But Piketty obviously has been, the star here. Similarly, Wilkinson and Pickett's spirit level has had an impact which is, extraordinary and very unusual in the social sciences. You don't necessarily have to agree with them, and I don't entirely. But as a starting point in thinking about the impact of the Great Recession, they seem the obvious starting points. And the question then arises is, can we expect that with the economic crisis will lead to further polarization, with increasingly sharp gradients in terms of both objective outcomes and the manner in which they are experienced, okay? Now, that's the assumption a lot of people make. I come from Ireland, and of course, we all start to think about these issues from the point of view of our own environment and our own countries. But of course, Ireland is a particularly interesting case because of the extreme nature of the recession it experienced after a boom. And if you look at the economic and political debates in Ireland, a great deal of that debate assumes exactly that sort of polarisation I'm talking about. So there tends to be an assumption that economic change and the policies introduced, generally referred to in shorthand as austerity policies, have indeed been produced with increased inequality across classes and reduced social cohesion, which would fit with both the Piketty and Wilson and Pickett volumes, okay? However, as you start to try and do some empirical work on this, it's not entirely clear that the main mechanisms which Wilkinson and Pickett address trends in long-term inequality and their impact. In particular, if I take the example of status anxiety, it's not particularly clear that they're entirely helpful in understanding the impact of the Great Recession. Does this sudden, abrupt change in economic circumstances operate through the same mechanisms as long-term trends in inequality? As I say, it's far from obvious, okay? And it's far from obvious that it's the necessary starting point. Similarly, and this is not a criticism of Piketty, because he was doing something quite different, but Barry Eichengreen, in his wonderful book, Hall of Mirrors, where he reviews the crisis across a whole range of countries and indeed connects it to the Great Depression, he notes that, in a sense, Piketty treats the recent economic crisis as a blip, he puts it. This is Eichengreen's quote. And the only reference to the current crisis is a reference to inequality and debt, and a reference to mainly US literature relating pre-crisis stagnation to a decline in purchasing power of the US middle classes, which is then compensated for by increased debt. Okay. But this is interesting because one of the clear alternatives to notions of polarization across classes is this increasing focus on squeezed middle class and the notion that financialization and increased availability of credit provides an alternative to the polarization perspective. So rather than a simple polarization, the situation of the middle classes changes because of the availability of debt on a scale which was previously unheard of. Now, the notion of middle-class squeeze in the US comes in a very different context to the European context, and I'm not trying to equate them in any fashion. It is different roots. However, a great deal of literature does show that debt levels in Europe, although arising in a different context to the US, have increased significantly over time. And so this issue of middle-class squeeze is at least worth looking at. And worth looking at not just in an academic sense. So again, in the Irish context, on the one hand, and I take the Irish context just as an example, on the one hand, there's a large body of people, trade unions, left-wing parties, social agencies and so on, who have argued the polarization case very, very strongly, okay? On the other hand, in a context where there were substantial cuts in public sector wages of the order of about 25%, which I'm not sure Mrs. Merkel has actually realized yet when she encouraged us to engage in structural reform. Large-scale cuts in public sector, large-scale increases in taxation, cuts in public service which go way beyond, whose effects go way beyond sort of poor or marginalized groups. In that context, notions of middle-class squeeze have had a great deal of resonance, and media, in particular, have taken this up, very, very strongly. So, on the one hand, you have notions of class polarization. On the other hand, you have notions of middle-class squeeze. Now, the evidence, a lot of this debate has been based on, has been largely of a rhetorical form, and very little of it has actually been based on analysis based on evidence, okay? And if you look for a starting point, again, when you look at the literature, it's not entirely clear that one's expectations of what will have occurred will be entirely straightforward. Tony Atkinson and his colleagues produced a very broad review of the relationship between economic crisis and inequality. And their conclusion, and this is a long-term historical study, and the conclusion they reached was that there were basically very little in the way of hard and fast patterns, either in terms of inequality as a cause of crisis or crisis as a cause of inequality. And as I say, they provide a very comprehensive review of it. So I think we need to keep an open mind in it. Similarly, Stephen Jenkins and his colleagues, including my colleague Brian Nolan, did a very broadly based analysis of the impact of the recession. Now this is, over the initial period of the recession, and it may turn out that longer term effects are different. But again, they showed that these effects varied extremely widely, that it was very difficult to reach simple conclusions about the consequences of the recession for inequalities of this sort. And so a good deal depended on the nature of the macroeconomic turndown in particular countries, but also in particular the role of cash transfers and taxation policies, the role of automatic stabilizers, okay? Similarly, the Gini project, which looked at these issues across a whole range of countries and which I was involved myself, reached rather similar conclusions, okay? So as I say, what one can expect to find in analysing these issues is maybe not as straightforward as some people have tended to conclude. Now, in looking at these issues, income remains obviously central, and we will look directly at, at income. But part of the longer-term work that Brian Nolan and myself in particular have been involved in is that it is often frequently necessary to go beyond income to look at sort of wider deprivation and to look at wider issues of economic stress. Again, I'll take the Irish case as an example of that. If you look at the long-term situation in Ireland, coming from the most extraordinary boom to a catastrophic bust, okay? Throughout that period, if I graphed the poverty rate for you, the poverty rate is almost a straight line, i.e. there was actually no serious variation in poverty rates across that period of time from the late 90s up until now, okay? If I looked at inequality and I looked at the Gini coefficient, you would find a similar pretty straight line. There is no evidence that over that period of time that inequality increased or declined in any systematic fashion, okay? Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that nothing changed in society. Clearly, quite dramatic changes occurred of an upward trend, and quite dramatic changes have occurred in terms of downward trends. But they are simply not captured by Gini or by conventional poverty measures. And so if we want to try and understand what's happening, we need to go beyond those. Okay, in trying to do so, we're going to look at comparative analysis. We're going to focus on 16 EU countries, okay? We chose to focus on these countries because we thought these issues of polarization and middle-class squeeze were primarily relevant to more developed European economies. And we dropped Luxembourg because Luxembourg is a strange case, and apologies to anybody from Luxembourg, but it's very hard to draw conclusions about Luxembourg given the nature of inequality in society. So we've got the original EU 15 minus Luxembourg, and then we have Norway and Iceland, okay? As I go on, I'm going to group these countries at various points into welfare regimes, okay? However, I want to make one thing clear. As you will go on, you will see that what we're trying to explain here is change over time between 2008 and 2012, okay? So we want to look at the distribution of key outcomes across income classes in 2008, look at them again in 2012, ask how did they change, and ask what we might be able to say, if only in a limited fashion, about how those changes were produced, okay? Now clearly, welfare regimes are highly unlikely to be able to explain that short-term change between 2008 and 2012. So I'm using welfare regimes largely as a typology. I'm using it for a couple of purposes. As a starting point, it provides an indication, it provides a benchmark of a starting point. What was the situation in 2008? How were these outcomes distributed across welfare regimes and across classes? It provides a descriptive account of those. You can argue about whether that variation which exists is welfare regime per se, or whether it's welfare regime capturing other phenomena. For the purposes of my presentation in the paper, it's not crucial, okay? The second purpose for which I use welfare regimes is as a benchmark. To anticipate, our analysis identifies Iceland, Ireland, and Greece as countries which experienced a scale of change which was dramatically different from the remaining countries, okay? So at various points as I go through, I will compare those countries with the remaining countries in their welfare regimes, okay? So you can actually get a benchmark of what the scale of that change was. In order to conduct the analysis, we're looking at some key factors, some key variables. We develop a set of income class categories. Well, develop is probably too strong. We use the income data to construct a set of income class categories. If you want to ask me questions later about why we use income class categories rather than social class categories, I come back to that. But for the moment, I'll go on, okay? Secondly, then, we develop measures of material deprivation and economic stress. And what I want to emphasize here is that the approach that we have developed, and we've been saying this for some time, but nobody in Brussels or in Eurostat appears to have been particularly listening to us. This differs from the EU approach. The EU measure of material deprivation, we would argue, mixes objective deprivation with economic stress, okay? Which is of a more subjective sort, although the distinction is not absolutely 100% clear. But we feel it is important to make that distinction. So, for instance, if we take our different factors, you can start with income, okay, and we will look at income. We then look at material deprivation. Material deprivation we expect to be influenced not only by current income, but also by wider resources, by social support systems, and by life course stages, okay? So that there are a whole series of additional factors over and above those that we might expect to affect income, which may affect material deprivation. And this is why, much less than people actually expect, the relationship between income and material deprivation is actually a great deal weaker than people expect. So if you take something like the 60% poverty line, and you construct a material deprivation measure which captures about the same proportion of people. Only about 50% of those below the income poverty line will be below the deprivation threshold. These are not capturing exactly the same phenomena or anything like it, okay? They are, of course, correlated. Economic stress we then see as being influenced by the sort of factors which influence material deprivation, but also by financial obligations. It's influenced by a whole range of factors, but among key factors, by financial obligations and by reference groups, okay? So you can certainly imagine a situation where somebody is well above the income poverty line, is not materially deprived in any particular sense, but particularly in the context of the current recession, is experiencing a set of financial obligations, for example, in relation to housing. So if you were in Ireland and you had borrowed to buy a house at the peak of the housing market and suddenly found that your house was worth 50% less than it was previously, and that your salary had been cut by 25%, irrespective of your deprivation situation, you might well find it difficult sleeping at night. But it's also, of course, affected by reference groups. When you ask people questions about how they can, it's also by coping capacities and reference groups. So if you ask people how they're experiencing issues in relation to debt and so on, part of what you're getting is their actual objective situation, okay? They have a large mortgage, their salary's been cut, so. But the other part is relating to, or other parts relate to their capacity to cope with those. There's a significant body of literature that shows the manner in which people cope with the same objective levels of debt and so on can vary significantly. Similarly, reference groups obviously come into this. People build up a series of expectations of the sort of standard of living that they might expect and so on. And disruption of those expectations, even in circumstances where their material living standards remain well above minimal thresholds, can obviously be reflected in measures of economic stress. So they're the key variables we're distinguishing. Okay. The income categories we've developed, and these have been developed in the context of a very substantial discussion in the literature, mainly by economists involving people like Andrea Brandolini and Tony Atkinson. And you can clearly come up with a different set of categories, and we can talk about that later on. But basically we distinguish between the conventional income poor, below 60%, a precarious income class, who from 60 to 75, what we call the lower middle class, 70 to 125, upper middle class, 125 to 126, and then what we've described as an affluent class of 166% plus. So this is the set of income class which we operate. Deprivation is measured by a fairly obvious set of items relating to, and it relates to not being able to afford these items, not being able to afford, food, keeping home adequately warm, certain, consumption goods, personal computer and personal car. Okay, so the idea is that it's not simply a question of possession. In terms of the responses that people give, it's that they can't afford, that their economic circumstances are such that the household cannot afford these items, okay? Now, of course, to some extent, we're dependent upon people's responses in distinguishing between enforced absence and taste, okay? And there's a discussion in the literature on that. The deprivation measure is not as good as we would like it to be. We're restricted to what's available in EU Silk, but it has a reasonable level of reliability, and the level of reliability doesn't vary a great deal across countries. So we've some reassurance that the differences we observe across country are not simply a consequence of error, of the measure being measured better or worse in some countries rather than others, okay? So we hope to eliminate as much of that noise as we can. The economic stress measure is, we can achieve a much higher level of reliability. We actually get a level of reliability which is very satisfactory across all of the countries we deal with. And you can see it deals with difficulty in making ends meet, dealing with arrears in the last 12 months, experiencing housing costs as a financial burden, finding repayment of debts a financial burden, and inability to cope with unexpected expenses. So that's the measure of economic stress that we have. Okay, I'm not going to present you with any actual numbers, but I'm going to present you with a number of graphs, okay? Now again, in terms of presenting these, we have grouped them in terms of welfare regimes. So as you can see, the slightly different colors at the end of each cluster refer to the average for the welfare regimes. So what happened to income adjusted for inflation between 2008 and 2012 in these 16 countries, okay? Well, within the social democratic regime, you can see that Iceland stands out as, as an absolute exception, okay? So income levels in Iceland dropped catastrophically, okay? Within the corporate regime, you can see nothing much happens, okay? And in fact, we dropped the corporate regime from our later analysis because nothing much happens during that time. The liberal regime, which is basically the UK and Ireland, what you actually see is that income levels dropped in both countries. Now, I think the UK is a little bit of an anomaly because my understanding is that the way in which the data was collected in the UK changed between 2008 and 2012. And I think it causes some problems with the UK. If you look to the Southern European regime, you see in a number of the countries, income levels fall. But what I'm particularly interested in here is that in Greece, it falls very significantly. It falls in some other countries, but not as dramatically, okay? Again, you can see the regime levels at the extreme there. Okay, material deprivation. The picture in relation to material deprivation is also reasonably clear-cut. Again, within the social democratic regime, the level for Iceland increases very substantially. Now, it increases from a very low base. In 2008, deprivation levels in Iceland are extremely low. They almost double between 2008 and 2012, but of course still remain modest in comparison with other countries, okay? Again, for the corporate regimes, there's nothing terribly interesting going on. In the UK and Ireland, deprivation goes up in both countries. They actually reversed their order. In 2008, the deprivation levels were higher in the UK than Ireland. In 2012, they're higher in 2008 they were higher in the UK. In 2012, they're higher in Ireland. But the change isn't as dramatic as some of the other things we see. Again, if we look at the Southern European regime, we can see that very significant increases for Greece, also for Italy, a slightly funny drop in material deprivation for Portugal, which I'm not sure I can entirely explain. Again, looking at the same changes for stress, this emerges to be actually sharper and clearer than the income or deprivation differences. So if you look at the social democratic regime, you can see there is an increase in economic stress in Iceland, which is quite different from that for any of the other countries, okay? Iceland stands out very clearly as a country where the mean levels of stress experienced in households rose quite dramatically and were quite different from those for the other countries, okay? Again, I'm getting boring repeating myself. Nothing much happens in the corporatist countries, okay? When you compare Ireland and the UK, you can see that in contrast with the situation in relation to income and deprivation, where we weren't seeing great differences, now we see that for Ireland, the levels of economic stress rose much more sharply than for the UK. Similarly, when we go to the Southern European countries, it is Greece which stands out as quite clearly the country which experiences the most dramatic increase in economic stress levels. Overall, if we take the three elements together, Iceland, Ireland, and Greece emerge as quite distinctive in terms of the scale of the change they experienced between 2008 and 2012. And going forward, I'm going to concentrate on these countries, but compare what's happening to them to the other countries in their welfare regimes. Okay, a summary of those graphs that I showed you. What actually happened between 2008 and 2012? Well, there were income reductions in Iceland of 40%, Greece 30%, and Ireland 20%. In the case of Iceland, it's necessary to remember that Iceland, since it wasn't in the euro, actually devalued its currency, okay? And that's a sort of significant difference from from other countries, okay? Greece and Ireland were among the highest increases in deprivation, okay, in absolute terms. Iceland's level doubles while remaining modest at an absolute level, okay? There were distinctive increases in stress levels for Iceland, Ireland, and Greece, okay? Now, I'm going to focus on change between 2008 and 2012, okay? What I'm trying to explain as the bottom bullet point there, what I'm trying to account for is the changing impact of income class over that period of time on economic stress. How did the distribution of economic stress across these income classes change between 2008 and 2012? I'm also going to be again concerned about how that change was mediated by corresponding changes in income and deprivation. Does the changing impact of income class on economic stress, can that be accounted for, or to what extent can it be accounted for by corresponding changes in income, in the distribution of income across class and the distribution of deprivation across class, okay? However, the bullet point one from the bottom, what I want to note is that there is also overall significant stability in class and welfare regimes. So we're looking at the change, but if we just look at 2008, at that point in 2008, I'm showing the distribution of economic stress across income classes, across welfare regimes, okay? And if I looked at that in 2012, it wouldn't look dramatically different, okay? We're going to focus on the changes, but you know, the absolute change is not dramatic. Now, what this graph tells us is three things. Hopefully I'm counting right, okay? The first thing is that economic stress varies systematically across welfare regimes, okay? As you go from left to right, you can see that for every income class, the bars get higher, okay? Economic stress increases systematically across welfare regime for every class. Within every welfare regime, income class has a substantial effect. Within every welfare regime, there's a straightforward pattern of economic stress being higher in the poor groups and declining gradually as you move from the poor to the affluent class, okay? What's not as immediately apparent, but is clear from statistical analysis, is that the impact of income class varies by welfare regime. So the extent of differentiation in economic stress across income class is weakest in the social democratic regime, is intermediate in the corpus and liberal regimes, and then is weaker in Southern Europe. So in Southern Europe, stress levels are extremely high, much higher than for any of the other the other welfare regimes. But the extent of class differentiation is slightly less, okay? Now, all I want to do with that is, this provides some reassurance that what we're measuring with economic stress is something systematic and important, okay? But now I'm going to go on and focus on change. So what I want to know now is, to what extent did the distribution of economic stress across class vary between 2008 and 2012, okay? And I'm going to take you through this for Iceland first, Ireland second, and Greece third. And then, just in case you have difficulty in interpreting these graphs, I'm going to come back to summarize those findings, both verbally and in a final organizing graph, okay? Now, if you look on the right-hand side, and this again may get just a little bit boring, okay? I have included, on the left-hand side we have Iceland, okay? And on the right-hand side we have all the countries in the all the other countries in the social democratic regime. And as you can see, on the right-hand side, we could swap the graphs. We could swap the graphs for 2008 and 2012 without making any change, okay? There is not only did the levels of economic stress not change very significantly in these countries, but the patterning of class differences didn't change very much, okay? And so they provide a benchmark for what happens in Iceland, okay? If you look at Iceland, what you see is that in every income class, economic stress increased. There was an across-the-board increase in economic stress, okay? The smallest increase is in the affluent class, and you might say that's obvious and predictable, okay? What's not obvious and predictable is that if you look at the green bar, that's the lower middle class, and that's where the sharpest increase comes, okay? Now, the levels for the poor increase, the levels for what I call the precarious class increase, but the most dramatic increase occurs among the lower middle class, okay? So in Iceland, you get a certain form of polarization, which is that all classes other than the affluent class do worse over time, okay? So if you like to say that the level of economic stress increase for the affluent class is smaller than for any other classes. So while its absolute situation deteriorates, its relative position actually improves, okay? But this doesn't occur in any kind of straightforward, hierarchical, general polarization fashion. As I say, it is actually the lower middle class whose situation deteriorates most over time, providing support for a particular form of lower middle class squeeze argument. Okay, turning to Ireland, again on the right-hand side, you have the UK, and nothing much changes between 2008 and 2012 in the UK. Okay? In Ireland, again, there are very substantial increases for every, for every class. Okay, even the affluent class see their levels of economic stress, increase. However, the class for which economic stress increases most is actually, again, the green bar is this lower middle class group, okay? However, there's an important difference between Ireland and Iceland, okay? In Iceland, what happened was the lower middle class situation deteriorated most, but then the remaining classes were fairly similar. So in fact, a large part of what you get is a contrast between the affluent class and the other classes. In Ireland, you see a rather different pattern. I mean, in Ireland, what you see is that it's these bottom three classes who did rather poorly. It is the, in particular, it is the income poor group which does very badly. Okay, sorry. Yeah, in Ireland, what happens is that it is the income class group, the income poor group do very badly, the lower middle class do very badly, the precarious class doesn't do quite as badly, which I think I can explain to you in terms of particular features of the Irish welfare system. Because among this precarious class are the more stable social welfare recipients, okay? Whereas among the income poor classes, you get people who are often highly transient. People who lose their jobs, are in the lowest income groups for fairly short periods of time, are not captured adequately by the welfare system at that time. Above them, as I say, are groups who are on more permanent welfare arrangements. And due to the way in which the welfare changes were implemented during the crisis, they don't do as badly. So in Ireland, what you get is a form of polarization. You do get a polarization between the bottom three classes and the top two classes. But it's a form of polarization which extends into this lower middle class group, which is a very substantial group. So in Ireland, it's not easy to say, either or. This is polarization, this is a middle class squeeze. It is in some important respects both, okay? And that's the situation that is the situation you get in Ireland, okay? Turning to Greece, you see that again, the other remaining southern European countries, there's no change over time, okay? Now in Greece, in contrast to Ireland and Iceland, what you get is actually a pretty straightforward pattern of polarization, okay? The lower your income class, the more the level of economic stress increases, okay? Okay, here I summarize the changing effects, okay? So on the left-hand side, you have Iceland, and you see this green bar suggesting a lower middle class squeeze. All the other classes do worse relative to the affluent class, okay? In Ireland, you have the income poor class and the lower middle class who do dramatically worse, than the other classes. And in fact, the three bottom classes do worse relative to the affluent class. So you have a form of polarization, but also a form of middle class squeeze. In Greece, you have a straightforward polarization, okay? Okay. So again, that just summarizes what I said there, okay? Since I'm running short of time, I'm going to skip over that. Okay, what happens in terms of the role of income and deprivation? Well, what happens with income and deprivation is that income has no effect on the changing pattern of class effects once you control for deprivation, okay? Once you have taken into account deprivation, income change has no effect. Deprivation has a significant effect, but only in the bottom 2 to 3 classes. So if you want to explain the levels of economic stress of the bottom 3 classes, deprivation turns out to be extremely important. If you want to explain the increasing levels of stress in the upper middle class and the affluent class, it doesn't serve any particular purpose. Other factors are coming in here, such as, for instance, related to housing commitments and so on. Conclusions. Economic stress levels increase very substantially, particularly in the 3 countries I've identified, Ireland, Iceland, and Greece. Changes in the size of the income classes play no role in accounting for that, okay? It's not about changes in the distribution of classes. Declining income levels have no net effect on changing income class effects on stress after controlling for deprivation, okay? Any income effects that are there are mediated by deprivation. Iceland experienced a form of middle class squeeze in relation to stress, despite increases in material deprivation being concentrated in the lower income classes, okay? In Ireland, there was a polarisation between the poor and the lower middle classes and the upper middle class and affluent classes, but the precarious class improved its relative position. In Greece, you get the strongest evidence for polarisation, involving a contrast between the 3 lowest classes and the 2 highest classes. Deprivation was the key mediating factor in all cases, but primarily for the 3 lower classes. So to come back to Atkinson's starting point, what we see is that there are similarity and differences among the hardest hit countries in relation to polarization and middle class squeezes, okay? As Atkinson put it, there's no hard and fast pattern, okay? How would we go beyond the point where we are at the moment in terms of this explanation? What you would need to do would be to conduct longitudinal analysis in each of these countries. I mean, what you would need were some first-class panel data which would allow you to track the changes in impact over time and changes in the role of the welfare state. Unfortunately, I don't believe that EU Silk provides that database for reasons which I'm not going to get into in detail now. So I think we may be severely restricted in providing these explanations. But what is clear here is that the nature of these changes are not one that will be changed by multi-level models and by macro measures and all kind of fancy statistics. If you want to understand further what has produced these changes in these countries, you would need in-depth analysis. I'd be happy to offer you that in relation to Ireland, but I'm not going to be foolish enough to attempt to do it in relation to Iceland and Greece. And on that note, I'll finish. Thank you.